Excellent. Okay, despite the fact we only have 32 people here so far, which I'm sad because I know this promises to be a really good presentation, but we will go forward because we really want to honor people's time commitments here. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sue Osthoff. I'm with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, and I'm located in Philadelphia, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. And before we begin the actual presentation, I'm going to go over briefly some logistics for today's webinar. For those of you who have been on them before, I know it doesn't seem brief. But there is a lot of stuff to negotiate here, and we really want to make sure, particularly for first-timers, that they know what they're doing. If you're disconnected from the webinar at any time, just go back to the original email and click on the link, the join link, to log back in. And if you're still having problems getting back on, please call iLink support. And the number is 800-799-4510. And Katita, thank you. My coworker Katita Cavero just put that in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. And excuse me one second, there's been some funky things going on with the webinar service today. They just did an upgrade over the weekend, and we all know how smoothly tech upgrades go. So my coworker's coming in to say, okay, all right. So I think we're hopefully going to be okay. So for those of you who are not signed into the webinar service into iLink, I'll repeat that number. It's 800-799-4510. So like I said, Katita just typed that into the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. So why don't we look at that chat box down there. For a lot of you who have been on these webinars before know where that is. The bottom left-hand corner, there's a little, mine is green text that says type here to send a message. And that's where you can send messages to us during the webinar. And if you have questions, you can put them in there. And so why don't we just try it now? If you all will just let us know where you're located today, and if there's more than one of you at your site, if you can let us know how many of you are at your site, that would be great. So just go on down into the lower left-hand corner. Thank you, Jeff. So you can say the name of your organization and you know where you're from. If you want to add your organization, feel free to do that. Your city, your state, your country, if you're from Ontario, Canada. Thank you. This is great. You can see people are here from all over the country. So type on in, and then you hit enter, and that will then send it and get it up there for all of us. So as you know, everybody's on mute, or those of you who just joined may have figured that out. And so we're going to use that chat box during this webinar to collect questions that you may have. And then time allowing, we will pose as many as we can to the presenters at the end of their presentation. So feel free to pose questions there. I will acknowledge that we see it, and then we'll do the best we can to get back to you to pose those questions to our presenters at the end. If any technical problems come up, you can private chat me. Just so everybody doesn't have to see it. You see there's a public chat box that is now open. If you go over to the right, you see a grayed out private chat box there. If you go there, you should see my name there, Sue Osthoff. You can click on that and send me a private message. Okay? So feel free to do that. Or Katita, who is also assisting me there, it's Katita Cavero. And you can click on her name, and that will open up a private chat box, and you can send her a message. For those of you who are only on the audio portion today, you can email me with questions at sueo, S-U-E-O, at ncdbw.org. Again, that's sueo at ncdbw.org, and either I or one of my coworkers will get back to you. We are recording this webinar today, and you will be able to access this on our website hopefully in about a week. Our website is ncdbw.org. Also, right about a half an hour after this is over, I'll send out an email. It will contain confirmation of your attendance. It will include a link to our posted recordings, so you'll know where to get them, and a brief survey. And we really would appreciate any feedback you could give us, just so we can do better the next time. We also are going to have some questions for you, and why don't we go ahead and go to those now. So it's really helpful to know who's on the call. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to put up some polling questions. What we're going to ask you to do, those of you who are signed into iLink, who are signed into the webinar service, if you would actually answer directly on the screen, like you'll go up and there's going to be little dots there. So if you'll answer your question on the screen, that would be fabulous. And then if your answer is other, then if you could go over into the chat box and say what, to fill that out more, that would be great. So let me show you this. Okay, so now we're going to go to the polling questions. Maybe. It's been a little funky today. So here are the questions. We have these 3 short questions. You see up on the screen, like right next to community-based advocate, there's a little dot. If you can just fill in the appropriate answer for each of those, that would be really helpful. And only for those who are checking other, would you fill that into the chat box, please? Thank you. I'll give you a minute to answer these. So first, how do you describe your profession? And it's really helpful to us and important to us to know if you're an OVW grantee, and if so, which grantee program you're with. I'll just give another minute here. Again, if you can click your answer right directly on the screen there for the community-based advocates. Like shelter advocates, we would call community-based advocates. You could put it there. Okay, so we'll just move on now, but let me share the results, so particularly so our presenters can see it, but also so you guys can see who's on this call with us. So you'll see there that we have about a quarter of the people on the call are community-based advocates. And yes, it's true, they don't add up to 100% because it takes the percentage based on the total number of people in there, not the total number who answered. But you'll get some sense of the different distributions here. Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to move on now. So we're back to the polling questions and to the PowerPoint here. Okay, so thanks for that. For those of you who just joined, I am Sue Ostoff with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, and I again want to welcome you. And I thank you for joining us. This is the 3rd in our series of webinars about when survivors reenter their communities after jail or prison. And if you missed the other webinars in the series, the recording of the first one at this point is up on our website, and that was the one that was presented by Stephanie Covington, who many of you know or have certainly heard of, and that is posted on our website at ncdbw.org. We hope to get the recording of the one we had last week about a coaching project in Kentucky working with reentering women, and hope to get that up this week. And how it works is when you start listening, or if you click on it, you sign in, it brings you back to the iLink service, and you both hear it and you also have an opportunity to view the PowerPoint. So both of those kind of come up together. So you go to our website and then just go to resources, and that will bring you to the webinar recording. And please watch your emails for announcements of future webinars in the series. Before we go any further, I just want to really take a moment here to sincerely thank the Office on Violence Against Women for the support of this project on reentry. We just think it's so great that they're supporting work on survivors who are reentering their communities, because I think all of you know it's such an important part of the work of working with survivors. I also want to thank Carrie Sonmore and our colleagues at the Better Women's Justice Project for the continued and just truly excellent help and support with our webinars. And thank you, Marika, I see you're on, who's also with the Better Women's Justice Project. So everyone's muted. All the participants are muted. And as I mentioned earlier, we will collect questions during the presentation. down there in the chat box, and time allowing, we will ask as many of those questions to the presenters as we can at the end of the presentation. We'll try to leave about 15 minutes. So finally, as you're probably aware, today's webinar is titled Victimized Again, How the Reentry Process Perpetuates Violence Against Survivors of Domestic Violence. And our presenters today are two really wonderful women from Our Place, D.C., which is a women's reentry program located in the District of Columbia. And it's an organization that is dedicated to providing gender-specific direct services and advocacy to help formerly incarcerated women as they transition out of the criminal justice system. And our presenters today are Courtney Cross and Katrina Cheshire. And we are particularly excited about having them present today because so much of their work has focused on some of the unique needs and experiences of reentering survivors of battering. And in an effort to save time, we've posted their bios on this slide. Sorry for the very small print there. And we've also posted their bios on Google Docs. So you should be able to go ahead and read their full bios at your leisure. And I will post that link as they get going with their presentation. Just briefly, Courtney is currently the staff attorney at Our Place, D.C., and in this position she focuses on providing direct legal services to formerly incarcerated D.C. women, especially those living in D.C.'s most underserved wards. While she was a fellow at Our Place, she represented clients in domestic violence and family law proceedings, as well as in parole revocation hearings. And I think that's a really unique position that she had. We haven't heard of anybody else doing what she specifically was doing there. And before that, she worked as a victim advocate. Katrina Cheshire is a case manager at Our Place in their reentry services department. And she meets with soon-to-be released clients in the women's jail and federal prisons to develop service plans for them, or with them, I should say. Prior to joining Our Place, Katrina worked at DC Safe with their lethality assessment project, and she was an advocate with them. And she also worked as a project assistant with our fine colleagues at the Legal Resource Center on Violence Against Women. And like Courtney, Katrina also worked as a victim advocate. I know they have a lot to share with you, so I really want to get it over to them in just a second. But just as a reminder, if you're having trouble connecting, please call iLink Support at 800-799-4510. And Katita, if you would put that back up. Thank you very much. Again, for those of you on audio, it's 800-799-4510. For those of you who are on earlier, you heard me say the iLink service did an upgrade this weekend, and there's still some kinks that they're working out. If you have any other questions, you can either private chat me or put them in the public box down there. And if you're listening only and you want to call us, you can call us at 215-351-0010. And my coworker Emily is waiting to take your calls. Thank you, Emily, for your assistance again. So without further ado, I really want to turn this over to Courtney and Katrina, and thank you for all your great work and for your willingness to share it with all of us today.
Oh, thank you for inviting us. So just so everybody who is listening knows, my name is Courtney, and I'm in our Legal Services Department.
And I am Katrina. I am the Reentry Case Management Department.
So we just want to start out, before we get into any of the rest of it, talking about why we're so glad to be doing this presentation and why we think that it really does matter at several different levels. First of all, we think that understanding the intersection of reentry and domestic violence is critically important to the community of returning citizens, because these folks face a deficit of services but experience an increased vulnerability to violence and coercion that can jeopardize their successful reentry. We also think that there are huge arguments in terms of public safety for widespread understanding of this nexus, because obviously if returning citizens are struggling to the point that they are returning to dangerous or illegal behavior, then of course, this becomes a public safety issue. For those of us who are domestic violence service providers, whether social services or legal services, we think that this is also really important because without understanding these intersections, then we run the risk of ignoring the needs of survivors. And for survivors who are returning citizens, we run the risk of even possibly exposing them to heightened risk from collateral consequences of related criminal cases or community supervision. And as Katrina will talk about later in this presentation, we think that this nexus is also important because so many service providers use criminal records to disqualify survivors from their services, when in fact we believe that criminal records can often serve more as indicia of abuse rather than primary aggression.
And so I'm just going to talk to you guys a little bit about our Place DC and the services that we provide for those of you who do not know. We're a small nonprofit social and legal services organization in the district, providing nearly comprehensive services to currently and formerly incarcerated clients. To be eligible for our services, a client must identify as a woman. This includes individuals who identify as transgendered as well, be currently or formerly incarcerated, and finally, they must live in D.C. or plan to return to D.C. post-incarceration. Our Place DC supports women impacted by the criminal justice system by providing them with resources to maintain relationships in the community, help with resettlement after incarceration, and reconnect with their families. We provide an array of services to support women to remain drug and alcohol free, obtain decent housing and employment, gain access to education, secure resources for their children, obtain public benefits and other financial resources like funds for transportation, and maintain their physical, emotional, and mental health. So that's a lot. We offer legal services, which Courtney will touch on more later. We also offer reentry services and case management, which I will touch on more later. We offer employment advocacy. This includes linking women with employment opportunities in the D.C. area, providing individual assessments, employment classes, job searching strategies, and placement in pre-apprentice and apprenticeship programs and living wage jobs. Our employment department can also help with education linkage like GED classes and scholarship applications. In addition, we offer HIV women's health education. This department educates women while they are incarcerated and upon release about HIV and AIDS, including methods of transmission, prevention, and care. We also provide advocacy for women when they re-enter the community to secure health care and additional medical and mental health services. We offer housing counseling, which includes support with applying to transitional housing, Section 8 housing, and public housing, and also connection to emergency shelters, which we'll be getting into later on, especially as it relates to domestic violence. Additionally, we have a drop-in center, and I like to think of this as the heart of our organization. It serves as a safe and welcoming place for our clients to relax and connect with others who are reintegrating into the community. It is the point of access to the array of services that we offer, including clothing, transportation funds, and reestablishing identifying documents like birth certificates. We also have peer-led support groups that meet weekly during the evening. Some examples of some of the groups we have had include art therapy, a therapeutic writing group, and a women's support group, where a common theme is discussion on gender-based violence. Additionally, we have offered a writing center for women to expand and enhance their writing skills. The services provided in the writing center are individualized, so the clients, they get one-on-one attention and mentorship. And last but not least, we have a clothing boutique where women can come to get clothes for job interviews, church, daily wear, or whatever they need. They can also get toiletries here and undergarments, and we try to create the space so that it functions like a true boutique where the women can view and pick out clothes from the rack as they desire, as if they're in a store.
And I would also add about our clothing boutique, it's not uncommon that our Place DC is actually the first place that a woman goes when she's released from jail or prison. So we do try to have a huge variety of clothing based on seasonal sizes and everything that a woman might need if she really was starting from scratch. And that being said, because I am a staff attorney, I am going to focus a little bit on telling you about the legal services that our Place DC provides. Like the rest of the organization, we do try to provide one-stop shopping for the women. We know that when folks are coming home and trying to reintegrate, they are usually sent all over town multiple times to multiple places to try and address their problems. And so our intent is to minimize that as much as we can. So in our legal department, for any woman who's eligible for our services, we provide direct representation and advocacy in domestic violence matters such as civil protection orders and family law, so on anything ranging from divorce, custody, and visitation. And this piece is actually interesting because we will represent women who are still or newly incarcerated on some of these family law pieces. We also represent women in public benefits appeals, primarily SSI and SSDI, and like Sue had mentioned, in parole hearings, whether it's a parole revocation hearing for a woman who has been released and then locked back up for allegedly violating the conditions of her release, or an initial parole grant hearing. When a woman does come in seeking direct representation that we do not provide, we go out of our way to make sure that we send her with a tailored referral to an organization that we know provides these services. When we can, we try and link them when they're still in our office. Some of the few direct representation areas that we can't provide help in include landlord-tenant, because DC is flooded with phenomenal housing organizations, and also civil suits for damages, including suits against the government and against DOC. We don't handle those cases, but we always try and refer folks to people who can help. We also provide advice and information for currently incarcerated clients, and we do this through weekly legal clinics on the women's housing units at the jail, where we sit down with folks one-on-one and try and answer some of their questions, either by providing them with systemic information or following up with them via a phone call or a letter with information specific to their case. We have monthly legal education classes at the jail where we bring in non-Our Place DC legal services providers to speak to the clients about issue areas that might be critical to them when they come home, and so that they can be introduced to other organizations where they can go when they come home. And we also correspond in writing and via phone calls with women in the federal prisons, and also at the jail and DC's Women's Halfway House. And finally, our legal department does provide brief advice and assistance for walk-in clients. So anyone who comes in to get our services who has any kind of legal question is welcome to just come in and run it past us. And whether they need brief advocacy, whether they need a referral, or whether this is going to begin a case with us, we'll do that intake with them on the spot. And one of the ways that we try and provide the best services for a lot of our returning citizen clients is through a collaboration that we do with DC's Mayor's Office on Returning Citizens Affairs. They have an office in Ward 8 in Anacostia, DC, which is one of the district's most underrepresented and underserved wards. And we are able to use their office 3 days a week to try and connect with women there, whether it's women who are unaware of our place, or women for whom it's much easier to be able to get to the office there. We do try and provide all of our legal services in Ward 8 for those clients that's more convenient for.
And I'm going to speak a little bit more about reentry case management. And forgive me, I am a little hoarse, so hopefully you guys can hear me. So if there's an issue, just let us know. We are looking so that I can try to speak up a bit. In the reentry department, we connect with women while they're incarcerated and begin the process of coordination of services prior to their release. The services and support offered by the case managers continue after the client is released and until the client is stable. One of the things that makes us unique from other reentry organizations is that we literally travel to meet the women where they are, to offer that support and begin to build that relationship from the inside. As you may or may not know, DC does not have a state facility, so it contracts out to federal facilities. This means that women serving longer sentences have to do their time far away in a federal facility. The fact that Our Place DC makes an effort to travel to those facilities to meet with these women who will be coming back home to DC, I think is a plus. And of course, we also connect with our clients regularly at the DC jail at least twice a week. Case management is really designed for those clients who need a little extra support and more intensive assistance once they come home. We touch on a plethora of issues, so we conduct orientations explaining our services, and for those clients who are interested in case management services, we conduct in-depth intake at the facilities, identifying the needs and setting the goals. Some examples of things we address include housing, which is a major need. We can help coordinate getting a client into transitional housing, applying for single-room occupancy housing, and also public housing and or Section 8. Drug and mental health treatment is also something that we like to focus on. A lot of this includes helping our clients get into bed-to-bed programs for treatment directly from the facilities or connecting them to mental health support prior to release so they have it set up as soon as they get out. We also help with applying for public benefits. And additionally, I know this isn't on your slide, but I should also mention that we assist with family reunification, reconnecting with children and other families that can help support the client when she comes home. Upon release, the case managers help clients implement and adjust their release plan and collect data on recidivism.
And speaking a little bit about female incarceration in the United States, and I'm sorry that I'm pausing, I actually can't switch to the next slide, so we may want to wait a second to see if this catches up with us. Oh, there we go. Okay, so first of all, before I even get into this slide, which is ridiculously text-heavy, and I apologize for that, I just want to say that Katrina and my experience here at Our Place DC is gender-specific, so all of the experience we're drawing on here is related to working with survivors who are women. So we are not trying to stereotype, and we are not trying to posit that, you know, all survivors are women or that good survivors are women. It's simply that in drawing on our experience, we only work with women, so that's the focus of our presentation. But looking at this slide, we don't need to get too bogged down by the numbers, but by looking at the report from the Sentencing Project that just came out fairly recently, what we're trying to show here is that in the last 30 years, there has been a dramatic rise in incarceration trends in the United States, and this is specifically true for women. The rate of growth of incarcerated women in the last 30 years has been even higher than the already high rate of growth for men. And this leads not only to more women who are incarcerated, but obviously to increased numbers of returning female citizens. And because we view the reentry process as being lifelong, this number just continues to grow. Even as we see on that second bullet that the rate of incarceration has slowed down to 21.6% over the past 10 years, it's still a remarkably high number of women that we're seeing. And we would note also that at least in the district, we're talking about women being maybe 4 to 7% of the total incarcerated population, and the numbers are still very high, even for an organization that only works with women. But as you can see, the numbers are high and they're continuing to grow, but luckily at a slower rate. So we're hoping that is proof of a positive trend in decreased rates down the line. But moving to the next slide, we don't need to go through all of these. Katrina's going to talk a little bit about Our Place DC and domestic violence.
So I want to first start off by saying that we are not a domestic violence organization, but by nature of the services we provide, a vast majority of our clients do have domestic violence histories, so much so that we have included questions about domestic violence in our intake process so that we know as much about the client's history up front. So due to the correlation between domestic violence and family violence and incarceration rates among women, we frequently work with survivors and provide DV-specific services, including the gender-based violence peer-led support groups I mentioned earlier, domestic violence-specific housing advocacy to include connections to other domestic violence-specific programs in the community that we have partnered with, court assistance and advocacy, and Courtney will touch a little bit on that later on. And finally, we provide actual representation in civil protection order and related cases, and Courtney will talk about that as well.
And as Katrina mentioned, there is a correlation between domestic and family violence and incarceration rates. What I'm going to do just quickly is tell you a couple statistics that you can find if you go to the abuse history among incarcerated women resource that is linked to at the bottom of this slide. But I'm just going to tell you quickly that in 2002, Bradley and Davino, and again, this is in the Google Docs, but I'm sorry it's not a slide, but in a study of 65 incarcerated women, of those 65 women, 86.2% of the participants reported a history of childhood sexual abuse. 56.9% reported a history of childhood physical abuse. 67.7% reported a history of sexual assault in adulthood, and 84.6% of the women in this study reported a history of physical abuse in adult relationships. More interestingly maybe is that 43% of all of these women reported having been victimized in all 4 kinds of abuse, physical and sexual abuse, in childhood and adulthood, and that out of this entire study, only 5% of the sample did not report any abuse. So that is some background information showing what a lot of the women who are incarcerated have gone through, and we are now trying to move to the next slide, which is here now. Thank you. And what we want to talk about here is the fact that many of the discussions of the relationship between DV and incarceration focus on violence leading to criminal behavior. So they focus on how the domestic violence caused the woman to become incarcerated. And some of these causal links include women being locked up or arrested for self-medicating with illegal drugs, women being forced or coerced by an abuser to cooperate in or commit a crime, women turning to criminal behavior to meet the basic needs after fleeing or being robbed by an abuser, and this can be anything from solicitation and drug sales to theft or forgery. And then the final link that we note that can cause a survivor to become incarcerated due to the domestic violence is using force against an abuser, and the most common way that we see that is sort of self-defense gone wrong, and that is something that if there are questions about, we can discuss at length how it is that women defending themselves end up being the ones incarcerated. But I'm sure, as you can imagine, that in a relationship where there is a big strength differential, so in a often heterosexual relationship, although these strength differentials obviously exist in same-sex relationships as well, a woman may turn to picking up an object and using it as a weapon to get someone to stop hitting them, slapping them, or what have you. And because they escalated that violence and picked up a weapon, they are in fact the ones who catch the charge and who do get locked up. But what we really want for folks to take home, which is on the next slide, is the fact that those women whose involvement in the criminal legal system is not directly related to abuse like it is in the examples that we've just talked about, they nonetheless face violence-based challenges to their own successful reentry. Because like we saw from the numbers that we discussed, even if it wasn't domestic violence that caused them to get locked up, many of these women have gone through childhood and adult sexual and physical violence, and many of them are struggling with pre-incarceration trauma, and this trauma can obviously be exacerbated by the pressures of incarceration and reentry. I have noticed in the time that I have been doing this work that there can sometimes be a stereotype that the quote-unquote real victims only have a criminal record because of the abuse that they've survived. But at Our Place DC, we believe that someone's status as a survivor is neither determined by nor negated by her criminal history. And that is something that Katrina is going to touch on in the next slide.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on what Courtney said, it's almost as if providers have a quote-unquote soft spot for victims going through the reentry process who've been incarcerated due to the domestic violence rather than due to some other crime. But the truth is that many women get arrested for other things unrelated to domestic violence, such as theft, destruction of property, or whatever. And it does not change the fact that she might still be going through domestic violence in the home that she plans to return to once she releases. So we cannot, and I stress, we cannot forget about these women. And they should be entitled to the same reentry services and support. In other words, there is no such thing as a quote-unquote good victim or quote-unquote bad victim, but some providers will use that as a way to determine the services they provide to that woman. And this is unfortunate for women in this situation because in the absence of community support, they most likely end up returning back to the unstable, abusive home and relationship only to commit crime all over again. And so if we're moving on to the next slide, the nexus between reentry and violence against women.
And the one that's up is correct.
Yeah, okay, I wanted to make sure. So clearly we have been talking a lot about the strong correlation between domestic violence and reentry, but I also want to mention how a lot of these women suffer while they are actually incarcerated, and for some, it is just another form of victimization. It turns out to be that incarceration is just another trigger for trauma. And we're talking about jail and prison, so issues often come up with the conditions of the facility. For example, many women who are incarcerated do not get the right medications for their mental health while they're incarcerated, so they suffer from that. Some have no choice but to use toiletry products that might harm them, like a type of soap or lotion that might not be good for someone who maybe has eczema. And I mean, these are specific issues, but for a lot of women, they feel another form of victimization while they're inside. And a lot of the facilities make it a point to address the needs of women suffering from, or do not make it a point, to address the needs of women suffering from domestic violence trauma, like having support groups or therapy sessions available to them in the facility. So, the woman could really be suffering from some type of traumatic issue and not able to talk about that or get the therapy that she needs on the inside. Additionally, to be released from jail or prison on parole or probation or supervised release in D.C., a woman must first provide a stable home address and have it approved by the supervisory agency. The problem with this is that many women are either homeless prior to incarceration or living in unstable homes to begin with. So a lot of women who will be supervised once released can be at an even greater disadvantage if they have domestic violence issues. Women will also often provide addresses to previously volatile homes in order to have their release plans approved. They do this because they have nowhere else to stay. But once they list that place, they are expected by the supervisory agency to stay there. Well, this might also mean that the victim does not bring up the domestic violence to her PO for fear that the address will not get approved, so it is almost a lose-lose situation that she finds herself in. And even if the victim does tell her PO that she has DV issues and or needs housing, it does not mean that the PO will assist with getting her housing or support her right away. So we're moving on.
So what we're going to talk about next is the way in which a woman's status as being on supervision, whether it is probation, parole, or supervised release, the way in which that actually affects the domestic violence. Because one of the things that I had not anticipated before beginning my work in this field is the way in which someone's status as being on supervision or on papers, as it's called in the community, how that would play into the violence that they're enduring at home. And what we've come to see is that many returning women, and especially those going back to violent homes, but even those who are going back to a new place, face heightened vulnerability relating specifically to their supervision that is exploited by their abusers. So you can see some of the examples that we have provided here include, and these are all from clients of mine, a husband falsely telling a client's PO that she doesn't live with him, effectively evicting her. She was forced to go out and find a new residence almost immediately, and her PO assumed that she had been lying to her about the earlier address. A roommate threatening to tell a client's PO that she's using drugs unless she has sex with him, and a relative pretending to call the police every time she and the client had a disagreement. And these are all examples that have actually come up multiple times with multiple clients, wherein the abuser is explicitly taking advantage of the fact that because the client is on supervision and has all of these conditions of release that they have to comply with, they use that against the person, whether it's to exert their control or to coerce them into doing something. This is something that is surprisingly prevalent among returning female citizens. And you'll see some more examples on this new slide that I was just able to put up, in which the abuse specifically interferes with the client's ability to comply with the terms of her release. And I should say specifically and intentionally interferes with her ability to comply. And some of these examples include a boyfriend blacking the client's eyes so she would be too embarrassed to report to her PO, a boyfriend buying drugs for a client specifically so she wouldn't leave the apartment to drug test. And for one client who I represented in a parole revocation hearing, her boyfriend was clean and had been clean for years, but was so intent on controlling her and keeping her in his sight and out of the community that he spent his entire tax refund buying her a crack rock so that she wouldn't leave the apartment to test, so that she wouldn't leave to buy her own drugs, so that she wouldn't leave to report to her CSO. And she was violated for all of those things and received a 12-month hit in prison. Another example is a husband sitting outside of a client's workplace and calling her repeatedly until she lost her job. We have seen a roommate following a client to her meeting with her PO to make sure that she doesn't mention the abuse. This is fairly common, people going with someone to report and then sort of lurking around to try and hear what's being said. I was recently at a community supervision office and realized for the first time that all of these meetings occur in cubicles. So someone in the same physical space but not necessarily just right in that cube would still be able to hear some of these conversations. The last example is a client's girlfriend locking the client in her apartment and refusing to let her out to meet with her PO. The client actually wound up being unable to leave the apartment for about 3 days before she found a way to escape, and this was all because her girlfriend simply didn't want her to be able to leave. And I mean, if we think about it, these are all sort of textbook examples of the kind of power and control that an abuser is going to exert over the victim or the survivor in every possible opportunity to sort of prove their dominance. I will note that especially in civil protection order court, I have had luck with judges recognizing that there is an added layer of coercion here that isn't simply the intrafamily offense or isn't simply the domestic violence, but is the way in which it was done specifically to interfere with the client's community supervision. It isn't always the case that this is well received, but it is something that I will hit on in closing arguments and throughout the civil protection order trials so that the judge knows that this is layer upon layer of violence.
So why not leave after all of that? Well, despite all of these obstacles, reentering women may decide to remain in violent environments. One big reason for this, and I keep reiterating it, is that she may not have anywhere else to live and does not want to risk being violated for living on the streets. For many women, suffering through the abuse is better than suffering through living on the streets when shelter in the city is not always readily available, as a lot of you all know as social service providers. She often faces barriers in obtaining employment due to her criminal record, and she cannot afford to leave a wage earner and or free housing. Thus, leaving in this case means a blow to her financial stability, and her criminal record might in turn prevent her from becoming more financially independent from her abuser. Additionally, the abuser may be her only source of transportation. That's transportation to get to her PO, transportation to get to job interviews, transportation to get to doctor's appointments. For someone who is reliant on that, that would be a big reason to not leave. And a lot of the city is not offering Metro passes and tokens as before because funding has been hit. So a lot of folks, and a lot of these women are really dependent on that. Finally, she is told that her record and or supervision makes her ineligible for certain domestic violence housing programs. It's unfortunate that this happens, but it's true. A lot of domestic violence programs look at criminal history and often run background checks to determine who they will serve. Well, this is not always the best way to determine a primary aggressor, and I'll be touching on this a little bit later on in the presentation. Women also considering their kids. They don't leave because they don't want to have their kids in danger, or maybe the abuser is somebody who helps her with supporting the children.
And so now we are moving on to some of the specific impediments to leaving that are imposed by community supervision. So what Katrina was talking about do apply to all returning citizens, whether they are on papers or not. But what we're going to look at for the next couple minutes are barriers that are created simply by virtue of the fact that someone is on community supervision. And again, we only work in D.C., so I'm sorry if these examples are D.C. specific, but I'm hoping that they are going to be broad enough to be applicable in your jurisdiction. So in the district, when a man or a woman is being released from jail or prison on any form of community supervision, so for us, again, that's going to be probation, parole, or supervised release, they have basically a boilerplate sheet that they have to sign of release conditions that they are agreeing to comply with. And you'll see on a later slide that I have provided a link, so if you guys wanted to see it, you would be able to. But briefly, looking at the general conditions that they're agreeing to, these include things that prohibit them from living with other felons. And this can be problematic because this can rule out otherwise willing friends and family who would have been more than happy to take them in. These conditions prohibit women from leaving the jurisdiction without prior approval, which makes it hard for a woman who has experienced violence to flee out of state to friends or family. And the conditions prohibit women from living at unapproved addresses, which again make it very difficult to have the kind of flexibility that we need for family emergencies. Judges may also impose specific requirements. Most common, you'll see things like drug treatment programs, mental health programs, but also criminal stay-away orders may rule out living on certain blocks or with certain people. So the judge may flat out tell someone at sentencing that they are not to be within 300 feet of a certain block or a certain apartment building or a certain person. And if many of their support network lives in the same area, whether it's in the same building or the same unit or on the same block, suddenly they're precluded from returning there and don't have staying with these people as an option. And these are reasons, again, that folks are often forced to choose to enter volatile and violent home environments. We are going to briefly look at more specific conditions of release. Again, these are all just to serve as examples, but I think that by seeing some of these laid out, you'll begin to understand both why being on paper makes it extremely difficult to respond to domestic violence, but you'll also see why a woman may choose to remain in a violent home, because in order to comply with all of these things at once, she may not be willing to, go out and live on the streets or to leave a wage earner, because if she's not complying with all of these conditions at once, she runs the risk of being violated, which could mean receiving the rest of her sentence or receiving a whole new hit from the parole commission. So if we look at these, and we're just going to go through these again really quickly, some of the release conditions include not being able to leave D.C. without the written permission of the officer. So if something goes down at night or on a weekend and a woman's only option is to go to family in North Carolina or Chicago, then she's going to have to wait to run this by her PO. Meeting with the PO is obviously also difficult, because if what you need to do is leave the jurisdiction, or if what you need to do is move in with someone from whose residence it is not possible for you to commute to report, then you're again running the risk of missing these meetings and missing these drug tests. Again, these homes have to be pre-approved, so if a CSO or a probation officer goes to a home and decides that they don't like the look of it, they think it's in a bad area, they can just flat out tell the woman, no, you can't move here. So if a woman is trying to relocate from one home to another, it's entirely dependent on the PO approving that home address. She can't just move until they say, yes, this second place that you have submitted to me is acceptable. We see these continue, but again, we're going to race through them, that they include mandated drug tests, that They include women not being able to associate with someone else who is violating any law, that women cannot possess a dangerous weapon, and of course what is a dangerous weapon can be a case-by-case basis, but for someone who is on heightened alert of violence in the home, it is sometimes a dangerous weapon that they're going to rely on for security. We also see, going to the second to last bullet, that it says you must not associate with a person who has a criminal record without permission from the officer supervising you. Now this is huge because in DC there are about 900 arrests per week. Now only about half of those cases even get papered and generate a criminal case, but with that many arrests per week, it's extremely difficult to avoid associating with a person who has a criminal record. And when we're looking at some of these underserved communities, the amount of folks who have had run-ins with the police system are astronomical. So if you're looking for alternative places to go, your options are going to be severely limited based on the number of folks who may have criminal records. So thankfully, that is the end of going over those one by one, and I just have a couple notes about them. Again, that these were direct quotes from a certificate of supervised release that everyone's going to sign before they're able to reintegrate into the community, and I have provided a CFR where you can find it if you wanted to check it out. And again, just mentioning that on top of all of this boilerplate language, these individuals may also have specific conditions of release, including drug treatment, mental health treatment, stayaways, etc. And these are all things that women have to consider when they're thinking about leaving, is whether or not from a new and uncertain location they'll be able to comply with all of this at once. So I'm hoping that the takeaway from this is simply that the returning female citizen has a lot going on. Even without violence in the home, she is still thinking about what she needs to do to comply with all of these requirements constantly. These requirements make it harder to respond and react to domestic violence, and they also make it harder for her to be able to find those next steps and also to be willing to risk starting over in an unstable environment because she has her freedom on the line. So she may say that she would rather put up with this violence than relocate and not be able to comply with her release. Looking now at the next slide, which I've put up, obstacles to obtaining affirmative remedies. What I am meaning here is affirmative legal remedies, such as a protection order, which is probably the majority of the direct representation that I provide. So my caveat here when thinking about what is stopping a woman from either beginning the process or what is stopping someone who has filed for a protective order from going through with it, what I hope that everybody remembers is that the client just knows a lot more about her own situation better than we ever can, and she may be aware of a plethora of reasons why she should not get a protection order or why right now is not the right time. So for those of us who practice domestic violence law, we may get sort of stuck into this tunnel vision mindset of, the best remedy for domestic violence is a court-ordered protection order, and we may just see that as the only option. But what we'll see is that there are a lot of reasons that women are aware of that might not be the best thing for them. The first reason is that the client may have a warrant and will get stepped back if she goes to the courthouse for help. This is true in D.C., that if you go to file for a protection order and you have an open warrant, you could get stepped back then and there. And I actually had a client who I met in the parole revocation setting who had been unaware of the fact that there was a parole warrant out for her, went to try and get help for domestic violence with a boyfriend at home, and wound up actually spending the next 12 months in jail and then in prison because they stepped her back on it. And she was frantically trying to figure out the night she went to file, which was her first night in jail, where her daughter would go, how to tell her family, how to alert her job, that suddenly she was locked up and had no way of knowing at that point when she was going to come home. So if you have access to info like warrants and you're talking to a client about possibly filing, that is something that you should check. And for clients who are on papers, that is certainly something that you should discuss with them. A client may have violated the terms of her release in being in a certain place or around a certain person. This is what we just saw in terms of, you know, the specific stayaways, that if she is filing for a civil protection order, she is swearing under oath that she was with a certain person in a certain place, and if she has been told by a judge to stay away from them or stay away from there, then she's opening herself up to all kinds of liability because she is swearing under oath that she has now violated the terms of her release. We'll talk a little bit about this later, but she could also have an open case that would be affected by the testimony that she would be providing in a domestic violence case, and whether the open case is a criminal case involving the same incident as oh, I'm sorry. I just got a chat saying to explain what step back means. I'm sorry about that. So what it means to be step back is to have, in our case, it's the marshals pull you in on a warrant. So if you have a warrant and the marshals are alerted to this, they're going to instantly take you to the cell block in the courthouse if that's where you are and process you at the jail. So they're going to instantly be bringing you in on that warrant, basically. So then we were talking about open cases, whether it's she has a criminal case involving the incident of domestic violence. So she may be saying that she was attacked and trying to get a protection order, but she was arrested for pulling a knife on the person in that same incident. She may not want to be putting all of this information down in writing and swearing to it and then testifying at a trial that is probably going to happen before her criminal trial. The other thing that is certainly true in D.C. is also that because our judges rotate, the client may actually be in front of her own criminal sentencing judge when seeking a civil protection order, and that kind of knowledge about, you know, what the client has done in the past or that sort of bias from a judge is enough that the client may just say, I don't want to risk going in front of that same judge again. They're never going to believe me, or they're going to see where I've been and who I've been with and step me back, that the client may just say that now is not the right time to get a protection order. So in light of all of these, I do think that it is okay to ask if a client is on papers or has an open case or warrant, as long as you make it clear to the client that you're asking, because you don't want to open her up to risk her liberty by trying to affirmatively seek the remedies that she's entitled to, because she may end up back in jail before she knows it, and does need this information from service providers that these are risks that she's facing.
And to piggyback on, what Courtney explained, a lot of women do not seek help and support for domestic violence because they're faced with so many obstacles just around understanding the process on how to get help. So, I mean, a client's understanding of the process may affect her interest in filing for a protection order in general. Some women believe that the stigma attached to their criminal records will prevent them from being seen as a legitimate survivor or victim, so they do not seek the help. Additionally, some women are scared to go through any kind of legal process if they have criminal connections to the court for fear of being stepped back or whatever, like Courtney mentioned. It's the same reason why a woman might not call the police if she has just had a domestic violence incident. She may be scared of what officers are going to say or what they're going to do if they arrive, and she is the one actually asking for assistance. Will they prejudge her because she is also the same person they arrested last week for buying drugs? I mean, these are real issues that have to be considered. Also, some women don't think what they are going through is domestic violence because the relationship isn't intimate. Both parties are women, the parties don't live together, the violence isn't physical or constant, et cetera, the list goes on. But of course, that does not mean that she is not suffering from violence and or that she does not need to seek remedies. Also, some women have gone through the process before and it hasn't been effective for them. Maybe they've tried to get a protection order but could not locate the abuser to get them served, or maybe they got a protection order that the abuser didn't follow. These are reasons why she might not want to try to seek help again.
And then turning to, did you want to say something else?
No, that's good.
Okay. Turning to what we had talked about briefly in terms of if a client comes to you with questions about a civil protection order or a protective order or any sort of resource in your jurisdiction and the client has an open criminal case specifically, the advice that we would give is to get her permission and to communicate with her defense attorney or to advise her to provide this info to her defense attorney because her defense attorney may never have seen any documents filed or police reports relating to a civil case or domestic violence and may be completely unaware that the domestic violence even exists, which in turn could play a huge role in their strategy for a case, and it's a strategy that you would not necessarily want to jeopardize by encouraging the client to move forward without consulting her defense attorney. And one thing that I know is hard for a lot of domestic violence specific service providers is that it may just not be in the client's best interest to go forward with any sort of civil case before the criminal case is resolved, especially if she's opening herself up to impeachment in the criminal case by filing paperwork or by testifying. It may be in her best interest to get that taken care of first before making all of these statements that can be used against her. And even if her testimony is 1,000,000% consistent, she is still being re-victimized by being put on the stand numerous times and being forced to relive all of these same traumatic incidents time after time, especially if she's subject to cross-examination in multiple cases, in the civil case and the criminal case. Even if everything she's saying is entirely consistent, this is still going to be a difficult process for her. And what we all know about trauma is that it can impede the ability of someone to relate a story linearly or to relate it in the same manner on multiple occasions. And it doesn't mean that she's lying or being inconsistent. It just means that sometimes it's hard to get these stories out, and especially when you're under the duress of being on the stand, and especially if you're someone for whom being in the courthouse typically means you've gone to jail, you've lost your kids, then the pressures of testifying can be enough that if you let the woman know that this is going to be required of her, she may opt to not go forward with the case at this time. So I would say that it is really important for all of us to respect a client's choice to prioritize her liberty over her safety. But as I was reminded of not that long ago, it's also important for us to respect her choice to do the opposite. I had a client, I was speaking on the phone to a client recently and informed her that in filing for a civil protection order, she was going to be admitting that she had left the jurisdiction for a long time, that she had done so with someone else on papers, that she was consuming alcohol. And she had said, you know, I don't care that the risk of having her probation violated and going back to jail was minimal compared to the fact that she knew that if she didn't seek protection and get these services through a protection order, that she was going to, in her words, kill him and do a lot more time. So what's important for all of us to remember is that what clients need is information, but that they are able to process that information and make choices according to their own priorities, and that it's our job to help them achieve their goals and not to sort of criticize their goals or put their goals under a microscope, because they are able to sort of connect all of the dots in their own given situation, whereas, of course, we don't have the information to do that.
And so we're moving on to the next slide. Criminal records can be misleading. As I stated previously when I was speaking about why women may not leave, criminal records can be misleading and can be a huge reason why a woman may not get the support from domestic violence programs. Some domestic violence social service providers use individuals' criminal records to determine eligibility for services. This is not an accurate measure of whether a woman needs help, but that is what they will in fact do. For example, for some women, her criminal background with drug addiction might prevent her from getting housing, because a lot of domestic violence housing programs do not want to risk housing someone who might use drugs in the residence. Or prostitution could be on her record, and the housing organization may not accept her for fear that she might prostitute in the residence. You will also see victims being turned away for services if they have assault charges on their record because there's a fear she might get into an altercation with another victim living in the domestic violence shelter. And finally, a theft charge might be another reason to deny a victim housing because there's fear that she might steal from other victims in the residence or something like that. And again, here's where we get into the whole quote-unquote good victim versus bad victim scenario. It turns out to be just another barrier for the bad victim who may not have any intentions of committing any of her past crimes in the housing programs. And worst of all, some of these housing programs look at the charges and not always the conviction. So maybe the victim was charged with the prostitution or theft, but maybe she was not convicted of it. So just having the charge could be a huge barrier for the victim, whether she actually committed the crime or not. And unfortunately, you know, that can be used against her, and she may not get the support and help that she needs when she needs it. Someone's criminal record will not be very illuminating in determining whether she was the primary aggressor in a new situation. That means that just because I have an assault charge on my record in the past does not mean I'm not the one being assaulted or abused right now. And for many of our clients, that is the case. I mean, maybe they were dating someone else in the past and that comes up on their criminal record, or maybe it is the current abuser and they got charged, you know, like in a dual arrest situation where they were fighting back and, you know, also got arrested. But this time they are, you know, not the primary aggressor, not fighting back. Even if they were, it still wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but, you know, they are frowned upon because of that. Even massive criminal records may be a sign of victimization rather than aggression. For example, drug crimes can be evidence of self-medicating to numb the pain of violence she is going through. Solicitation may be her only means of financial support, or her pimp could be the abuser, which is why she continues to prostitute in the first place. Even violent crimes may be the result of self-defense gone wrong, and we see that a lot, as Courtney mentioned, with, you know, taking a knife and maybe stabbing somebody in a form of self-defense, but that's looked at as a violent crime that she's now charged with. So what are some other ways to help? Well, domestic violence remedies aren't the only or the best way to help a survivor achieve her goals. Remember, her goal should be directing the situation, not your perception of what her priorities should be. You have to let the client drive what is needed for her. She knows best what's going to work for her. If she's looking to gain independence, you can consider working with her to find employment or apply for benefits, help her identify housing options, and discuss family law options if she is worried about custody. If she does not want to leave, safety plan with her. Go over methods of remaining safe, like having a 911 cell phone, talking to her neighbors, having a plan of action for her children. Discuss opportunities for harm reduction as well, and emphasize your willingness to help her however she thinks is best. If you're an attorney, don't be afraid to make non-legal suggestions and collaborate with social service providers like Our Place DC if you need assistance.
And one of the things that Katrina and I have both been hitting hard on is allowing clients' own priorities to shape the services that you provide. We're obviously a client-centered organization, so we believe in that 100%. But one thing that I would point out that can make this difficult for some folks is that domestic violence can be, for some people, the kind of challenge that can be reprioritized on a weekly or daily and even hourly basis, depending on, you know, whether the violence has stopped for the moment, whether the client knows that she's in a safe period, or whether she has been moved to a safe house or is staying somewhere else. Once the violence has stopped, for some clients, it's at that point that they feel as though it's time to look at some of these harder to change challenges they're facing, whether it is homelessness or a criminal case or a case affecting their parental rights. With the domestic violence out of their face, they may then decide that it's time to put that on the back burner. And for those of us who provide domestic violence services, it can be a little bit jarring for us to realize that all of a sudden this client is just not interested. But it's not a lack of interest. It's that there are pressing concerns that can't be reprioritized the way that violence can be when you're out of it. And so it is critical that we'd be able to, change our perspective and our priorities as quickly as the client does, and to respect that when she has changed her priorities, that is an absolutely legitimate choice that she's making. So when we're talking about wrapping up, we believe that in order to best serve any client, whether she is a returning citizen or a survivor of domestic violence or simply any client seeking social or legal services, that we have to acknowledge and understand the full range of challenges that they're facing, and we have to respect their agency and their ability to prioritize them for themselves and their family. And when specifically speaking about returning citizens, this is important because our actions as service providers can positively or very negatively affect their return to the community and their ability to remain in the community in a stable and positive way. We had hoped that our ED would be able to pop in and share some final thoughts, but unfortunately due to scheduling, she is not able to, so you are going to have to deal with our final thoughts. And I guess for me, what I would hope the takeaway from this is just the recognition that choices that may seem irrational to some of us service providers, like staying with an abuser or not following through with a protection order case, are actually rational and well thought out decisions by women who are facing a panoply of challenges that intersect with and affect the violence that she's facing at home. And so if Katrina has any last thoughts for y'all.
I think Courtney summed that up to a T. But we would definitely encourage you, if you have questions or are dealing with a client in a situation like this, please reach out to us. We are happy to help. We love to partner with other organizations, so please feel free to contact us.
So if anybody has any questions right now, we are happy to take them.
We have a bunch of them.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, there are a whole bunch.
I hope not due to our lack of clarity, but bring them on.
No. I think we may be looking at a part 2. That's all I can say.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I just thank you so much. It was just a really excellent presentation, and for those of you who haven't heard the term before about returning citizens, it was just so nice to hear that used throughout. So thank you for that use of language.
Oh, of course.
It's language that we've been told by many people who are formerly incarcerated that they really like. So it's great. I really appreciated hearing that. I also just thought you gave really helpful examples of how abusers sabotage women's reentry processes, and that was really telling, I thought, and I'm sure this group could also come up with other examples, but that was incredibly helpful to see just the range of ways in which abusers do that. And also how the release conditions just really set up so many survivors.
They really perpetuate a lot of these problems.
Yeah. So let's get to some of the questions. We have about 15 minutes here. One of them was Darlene Johnson, who's with the Office on Violence Against Women, asked a really good question about, well, so when do you consider the re-entry process beginning? When does it start?
Well, I'll answer that question. I mean, for us, the reentry process begins when we meet with the woman in the facility. Now, we have criteria that we follow, and typically it's that we want to meet with a woman who's releasing at least within 4 months. Anything over that it's harder for us to create a reentry plan at that point because things can change in that amount of time. But we try to meet with the person directly in the facility. If they're releasing within 4 months, we'll meet with them. Sometimes we meet with folks who are coming out in a week, and so we have a very short period of time to sort of safety plan or come up with a housing plan of action for them, but we do our best. So it's different for each client. But that's just sort of the criteria that we use for case management.
And I have heard clients tell me that for them, reentry begins the day they get locked up because they immediately need to start thinking not only about sort of how to handle their business out in the community that is sort of without them while they're gone, but about, how to transition that into coming home and sort of getting the most stable start that they can.
And to piggyback on that, we actually provide services to women in the D.C. jail that are pretrial women. So these are women that haven't even been sentenced yet or convicted yet of a crime, and we're working with them on reentry needs and services because we know at some point they are going to be coming out. It's harder, but we do try to at least meet with them to just see what their needs are, whether it be having a legal team come in and talk to them, whatever they may need.
And one of the questions was about providing advocacy in the jails and federal prisons, as you do. And the specific question was, if women are having an issue with a CO or a counselor, can you advocate for them? And then I guess the follow-up would be, and then what exactly can you do?
Sometimes we do. I will say for me, we have a direct connection with the case managers in the correctional treatment facility, which is where the women in D.C. are housed. And so we collaborate and coordinate services with them. But the truth of the matter is that our organization, Our Place D.C., is really the organization that is providing the bulk of the reentry services for the women in D.C. Although there are case managers at these correctional treatment facilities in D.C., they don't actually do reentry planning like they do for the men. So I feel like the women in D.C. are sort of at a disadvantage. Now there's work, and talks about us trying to make that happen, but right now we're coming in there twice a week providing that actual service. For the women that are in the federal facilities, we travel to meet with those women, and we get a list of names of women that are going to be releasing back to D.C. within that 4-month time period. And we do often collaborate with the case managers there on a reentry plan. Sometimes it's just simply that the case managers there may not know the resources in D.C., so they're calling us and asking us, well, where can this woman go? She's going to be homeless when she comes home. She needs housing. And we can help coordinate that, whether it be setting up an intake over the phone with that case manager so that the woman can have an intake with a program maybe like House of Ruth that could take her bed to bed, or In Street Village, which often takes clients bed to bed. It just depends. But we really do. We're not trying to take it all on ourselves. We believe that collaboration and coordination is the best way to help get these women the services that they need.
And I would also add that from a legal standpoint, as I indicated earlier, we don't do anything close to suing any of these institutions. We don't do anything aside from providing information to the women on how to go through the grievance process, which is critical because if they don't go through the grievance process correctly, then they lose any right that they may have to sue. So once we've provided them with information on the grievance process, in some cases we will connect them to the D.C. Prisoners' Rights Project, which is run through the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and they do more of that legal work, and they have been instrumental in helping us to point a client in the right direction and getting them to collaborate together.
Great, thank you. A woman from, an advocate from New York City, how interesting. She's asking about public housing, and her question was, can you get clients into public housing?
Well, the list just closed in D.C. The D.C. Housing Authority list just closed. So I actually went with our legal director to the D.C. jail on the last day of the list and signed up 35 people and then ran to the Housing Authority office and stuffed them all into the box at about 4:55 p.m. to make sure that everybody is on the list. But really the question is getting them off the list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, women can be, they're still on 2002, 2003 cases in D.C., and we're in 2013, if that makes sense. So getting folks on the list is one thing, but as Courtney said, getting them into Section 8 housing, that's a whole other topic. And we do try to do our best with advocating for that. A lot of our work revolves around helping people hang on to their Section 8 vouchers or hang on to their public housing that they're at risk of losing because they are incarcerated, or maybe they missed their, recertification time or something like that. In addition to that, we also help women to get Department of Mental Health housing vouchers, which tends to move a little bit faster than the vouchers that women are trying to seek through D.C. Housing Authority. And these vouchers are set aside for folks who need housing who also have a mental health issue. That's not something that we just refer to their core service agency to do that, but they can coordinate that for them and do applications for them to help them to get that type of housing if needed.
Great. Thank you. Next question, two-part question, is about training. And the question is, have you provided training to probation and parole about the dynamics of domestic violence and its impact on a woman's success when reentering? And then a follow-up question was, and have you or would you provide training to correction staff about the intersection of DV, and in particular SA and incarceration?
Well, as far as parole and probation officers, what we do train them on is our services. And we have actually had several supervising officers contact us about our services. And much of today's presentation I have given in a sort of much more off-the-cuff way at events that are, so during Domestic Violence Month, there is usually an event with probation officers where I'll give a variation of this presentation. But DC's Survivors and Advocates for Empowerment does the bulk of the community education. I know that they educate the Metropolitan Police Department. I'm not sure what they do with CSOSA, but I know that CSOSA is our supervision agency. But I know that DC Safe has a much closer relationship with CSOSA than we do.
And that's a community-based organization?
It's the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency, so
okay.
It's everybody's probation, parole, or supervised release officer.
I meant DC Safe, sorry.
Oh, yeah, they're a community service
okay.
agency where Katrina and I have both worked.
Yes.
So we also, in terms of education, this same presentation, although again not formalized in this way, is something that I give to their domestic violence advocates several times a year. I give it to their advocates, to their volunteers, to their interns, in the hopes that, A, when they're sort of doing the frontline work with the clients right after an instance of domestic violence, that they'll remember this, but also so that when they're doing their community ed component, that they'll remember to sort of give a shout out to the needs of returning citizens.
Thanks. On the issue of training, parole, probation, and people working in corrections is huge about exactly what's the best way of training them, to what end, and what are we asking them to do. Are big questions, and so we've been really trying to research this and collect information. So if people have suggestions and ideas, please let us know. And I know a lot of different people are already working on that, and so we are trying to collect the good work that's happening out there.
And that's great. That is not something that we at least have done to this point. We have a very interesting relationship with all of the jails and prisons, but training has never been a piece of it.
And then, unfortunately, I think this is going to be the last question we're going to have a chance to ask, but it does, two people sort of were talking about this issue of what happens with POs accepting a domestic violence shelter or domestic violence transitional housing program as a release location. And have you found that that's an acceptable location for women to go to? And if there's resistance to that, particularly when people are being housed at confidential locations, have you had any success in addressing that resistance?
I actually have not dealt with the confidential location piece as of yet. I could see how that could be a problem because CSOSA, which again is our supervising agency, does require that they know where the client is. And so if it is confidential, I would imagine that they still would have to release that address to their supervising officer, which could be a problem depending upon what the supervising officer is going to do with that information, or whether even the supervising officer knows that that victim is in a domestic violence situation, because not all victims disclose that because they're scared that that could, be frowned upon or what have you. I have seen supervising officers list domestic violence shelters in the city as a client's returning address. I've seen House of Ruth a lot of times. Sometimes I've seen emergency women's shelters listed. The problem with that is that they don't always do the legwork. And so it might be on a client's, packet that they're going to their entry packet that that's where they're supposed to go. They show up there and that organization isn't willing to take them because an intake hasn't been done or they didn't know they were coming. And so I think one thing that would be helpful, and I don't know how to go about doing this, but it's just really train the CSOs and the parole and probation officers to know that just because it's a shelter, you can't just put it on the piece of paper and say that that's where your client is going to go. Because when she arrives there, she's at the mercy of that organization, whether or not that organization has space that night, whether or not they're willing to take her for all those other reasons that we mentioned during the presentation. Maybe they don't want to take her because they find out she has a criminal record. So it's really important to do the legwork. I mean, a lot of this could be prevented, too, if we could have a better collaboration with the probation officers, because we could sort of bring that up and we can kind of step in and help to coordinate the housing piece. But we see that a lot sometimes.
And I would say that a lot of Katrina's many massive victories have been coordinating this very piece wherein, because maybe the client is still at the feds and hasn't met with her supervision officer, nobody really knows who is supposed to be getting the housing piece set up, which is why our organization's ability to do some of the legwork and some of the gap filling has been critical, because for folks at the feds or for folks who are in transit from the feds and who are just sitting in little county jails waiting to come home on their way back from federal prison, nobody knows where they are because a lot of these parts don't communicate with each other. And so where our case managers have proved to be critical is not only just knowing where the client is, but being able to get all these parts to talk to each other and arrange for the necessary housing piece to come together in time for it to be ready when the client gets off that bus back in D.C.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And sort of a follow-up a little bit, or another piece of this particular pie, I think, is the question specifically is, do you find that POs want you to report on whether or not the survivor is still working with you or want to know about her location, and if so, how do you respond? And this is a huge issue for community-based battered women's organizations, and confidentiality, and if they're working with somebody, what is their role and function in terms of reviewing?
Oh yeah, our legal department adheres very strictly to attorney-client confidentiality.
Yeah.
And we also do in case management. So I mean, we will have probation officers call us to ask that question. It is not something, unless the client has instructed us to, that we, have to disclose. I mean, we know we're not going to get in trouble if we say, well, we're not going to disclose that information to you.
But
it might make the probation officer upset with us, but it's not something we have to do.
But
sometimes we will try and contact the client to say, hey, your PO has been asking after you. Don't know if there's a warrant out yet or if there's a violation report out yet, but, you should know that your PO is looking for you.
Yeah, and one of the things we have found, and I assume you do this, is that if you let the probation officer or parole officer know in advance, that's what your organizational policy is. That can really help things down the line. So
sometimes.
I mean, and we're not an enforcement organization. We're not CSOSA, we're not the jail, we're not Department of Corrections staff. We are sort of here to support our clients, and that's how we look at it.
We love to collaborate as long as collaborating is in the client's best interest, so we serve the client.
We do hope to have some community-based organizations, anti-battered women's, anti-domestic violence organizations, who are working with formerly incarcerated women, do webinars in the future and talk about their policy. So it's a huge issue. We're really trying to get information from people around the country who are doing it. If you're already doing it and have policies about it, we really are interested in hearing from you. Please write to us, call us, send us information. We really are trying to collect information so we can hand it back out with suggestions. Really trying to get information about best practices and good policy. So if you have good information, things are working well, lessons learned, please share them with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our really excellent presenters. You did such a great job and such valuable information. I don't usually say this with webinars, but I wish we had more time. And, we maybe should think about some follow-up here. Some of you, I know we didn't get to your questions. I'll actually try to follow up with some of you individually. You will be getting from us a follow-up email in about a half an hour. And in that we'll have the link to the Google Docs where those documents that were mentioned during the presentation will be up there, including the copies of the PowerPoint if you want to print them out, and some additional resources that were referenced. We'll get those up there. It will also have a link to our website, and we hope to have a copy of this up there in about a week, so if you want to go back and listen to it again. And please, we have a very short little SurveyMonkey survey, which is like a little evaluation. It really should take you like 2 minutes to fill it out. It's very helpful information to us and to our presenters. So if you can, fill that out, that would be terrific. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over for final words from our fine presenters, and I just really want to thank you very much.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for listening. I know that a lot of times we all feel like we're the only people doing this work and that we're the only people sort of beating our heads into this wall. So we would love, if people want to learn more about us or tell us more about you, we would love to collaborate just, so that everybody knows that there are people across the country who are doing this work and who sort of find this interesting and compelling to be thinking about. So please don't hesitate to contact Our Place DC thanks to this webinar to just sort of get the ball rolling and have a broader conversation about what works and what doesn't.
Oh, with that, I want to thank you again, and what I can say is to be continued.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can we hang up?
Yeah, you guys hang up, and I'll call you back actually in a little bit, okay?
Bye.